Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned to find out more. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. This is another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And today we are blessed to have a pioneer by the name of Michael Tamura. Has decades and decades, not decades and decades. I don't age you like that, Michael. He has been around the proverbial spiritual block a few times. Is a well-known author, has the book You Are the Answer, which we'll cover in greater detail. His website is michaeltamura.com. He speaks and he's helped hundreds of thousands of people across the planet. And he took some time out of his busy schedule to meet with the homies today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael Tamura to the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be on your podcast. And you're in Atlanta, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're coast to coast.
That's right.
Coast. Yeah. And so welcome. And we have a million questions, I'm sure I do, coupled with David. Just because it's really interesting, Michael, for the previous podcast, there was a theme where there were a lot of people coming on across the world. Actually, we just had a person from Australia on our podcast this past Wednesday, but a lot of people were kind of like two different entities or two different personalities, where they were living one life prior to 2012, and then after 2012, there was the spark, which I'm sure you have an opinion on, and then they had this whole different 360-degree turn, but with you were actually in this field prior to 2012, and
yes,
you've seen a lot of waves come and go. So I'm just happy that we actually have a pioneer, and I'd like for you to introduce yourself a little bit, to tell us about how you got started and where you are today.
Yes, because I've been around for decades and decades. It's a long story, but I was born and raised in Japan, and Sendai, the city in Japan where the nuclear meltdown happened and the tsunami and the earthquake a few years ago, well, that's my hometown. That's where I was born, but I grew up from about 3 months old in Tokyo, Japan, and I knew from the time I was very little, I knew that I had to come to California, and I was trying to get over here by the time I was 12, but generally parents don't let 12-year-olds go off on their own. Especially to a different country. So it took me 4 years of working at it, so to speak, to see, okay, how am I going to get there? Well, miraculously, everything lined up, and I was able to hop on a plane and leave Tokyo and go to San Francisco. And since then, I'd say a good majority of my life, except for a little bit in Pennsylvania, but most of the time I had my home in California someplace since I was 16. And my search, I thought I was going to be a medical doctor when I was growing up, because in Japan, the term for medical doctor and the term for a school teacher and the term for a spiritual master is the same. It's sensei. It's the same word is used for all three types of people, professions. And so I looked at that and I thought, okay, that's close to what I need to do and to be. And until I came to the U.S. and was going to college in California and going on the track of becoming a medical doctor, and all of a sudden I had this total knowing, intuition of this isn't the right track. This is something's not correct. It's not the same here. And so then I realized, okay, I spent about 3 years trained to be a nurse, licensed vocational nurse, worked in hospitals, all different kinds and different types of situations to get kind of a little more of a hands-on inside story of what it is to be in the field of medicine. And I thought, oh no, this is way off. It's not going to work for me to be a medical doctor. Although I did enjoy being a nurse. But I watched other doctors in the hospitals and people I worked with, and now there's just not the kind of communication I need to have with people that I work with. And so I dropped out of college and everything, even though my whole medical training was lined up. I had scholarships and everything. And so then I'm sitting there, 17 years old, and having no clue what my path was going to be, what my career was going to be. And so I just started to, I worked to see if I can earn my own living, and that was no problem. I just got all kinds of different odd jobs, and I had enough money. I never had problems with having money. And so I did different things and start to look. This is when my search started of what am I here to do? And long story short, I had a friend who got very, very in a lot of pain. She was visiting, and she was on the floor in a fetal position, just crying and in so much pain. And I was, by that point, I had my nurse's training and everything. And so the first reaction was, I'll take you to the emergency. And she goes, no way. She had enough strength to tell me, no way was I'm going to take her to the ER. And so I was at a loss. I go, okay, if you don't want me to take you to the ER, what would you like me to do? And she goes, you heal me. And at that time, 17, 18 years old or whatever, I had no clue of what does that mean. So, but just again, intuitively, I just decided to have to close my eyes, put my hand on her, and close my eyes, and I just thought about her getting well. And I felt all this energy, I felt all this light, and could come through my hands. And about 5 minutes, she calmed down. She wasn't crying anymore. She straightened out very peacefully, not in a fetal position, and she was very quiet. And then I continued, and then I'd say 15, 20 minutes later, she jumps up and starts dancing around the living room saying, I feel better than I have in months. And she goes, let's go dancing. And I was curled up in a fetal position on the floor by then, and I was in great pain. I didn't know what was going on. And I was literally thinking to myself, shall I have her take me to the hospital? But then I kind of thought it through, and I go, well, it's pretty painful, and I feel awful. But she was okay without going to the hospital. So maybe what I'll do is I'll try to sleep it off. And I said, I got to go to bed. I just went to the bedroom, closed the door, and I fell asleep eventually. And I woke up like 10 hours later. But I felt like a Mack truck had run me over. And I thought, well, this isn't good. But I was very happy because until then, I was going around San Francisco, walking around San Francisco, looking into everything, going, what am I looking for? And I did notice that every place I looked into had something to do with some form of healing. And it had something to do with raising or expanding your consciousness in some way. And whether it was Eastern or Western disciplines. And so I thought, excuse me, I didn't know, gee, what am I looking for? And when this thing happened, I realized I finally had a question. I need to ask somebody, what happened? How come when I put my hand on her and thought about her getting well, she did get well. She was completely in a better place. But I was in a terrible place. And so in my simple way of thinking at that time, I just said, okay, I must have done something right, and I must have done something wrong. So I knew there must be somebody who can tell me, what did I do right, and how could I do more of that, and what did I do wrong, and how could I do less of that. So I went back to walking the streets of San Francisco and just walked wherever my nose took me, so to speak, and walked into acupuncturists' offices, alternative healing places, Eastern philosophy, consciousness, meditation places, Tai Chi, Kung Fu masters, yoga masters, all kinds of people. And a funny thing happened where I would seek out these known spiritual masters from India, from China, from Japan, who were in San Francisco. And I go to their little talk, and usually at the end of the talk, each of the masters would say, okay, now I'm going to offer anybody who wants Shaktipat. And I didn't know what that was, but it sounded interesting. So since I'm there for the whole thing, might as well go for the whole thing. And I line up. Sometimes it's, line up in a single file. And I remember one was a yoga master from India, and he was also a medical doctor, as well as an Ayurvedic doctor, very accomplished person. And so the person gets into the front of the line, and he puts his finger on the forehead, and something happens. And then he lets the person go, and the next one, next one, next one. And I'm getting up to the front of the line. And I get to the front of the line. He looks at me. He shakes my hand and says, it's very nice to meet you. He bows, smiles, and then he passes me on. And I'm going, wait a minute. How come I don't get this thing on the finger on the forehead thing? And so I was like, that was strange. And I looked back. Everybody else behind me was getting it. It wasn't like he quit doing that. So I was the only one that he just shook hands, said, nice to meet you, and bowed and let me go. So I didn't know what was that about. Well, the next morning when that happened, I'm in my morning meditation, and I smell this incense, and I hear some music, and this man, the yoga master, shows up in my meditation. And she's smiling at me, and he bows, and it's like a feeling of reassurance. And then he disappears. And I thought, that's strange. So I continue my search, and I went to a Tai Chi master, and same thing. The Tai Chi master was giving each person a little bit of something, energy-wise, and I get up, and they bow and smile, and nice to meet you, and that's it. And then I went to a guru from India, and a famous guru from India, because friends of mine invited me to go along. I thought, oh, this is great. At the end of his talk, the interpreter comes on and says, now the master is going to give Shaktipat to everybody. great. And this one was amazing because there's, hundreds of people in the auditorium, and he's just looking at, vertical row at a time, and this arc of light comes out of him and goes right into this row of people, and everybody, jumps up. It's like, boom, and you can literally see everybody jerk as the light hits them. And I thought, whoa, this is cool. And it comes around, it's coming toward me, it's coming, the next person, and the next person left of me, and that whole row, from front to back, boom, it hits them, comes to my row, and I see the light coming, and it hits everybody, but skips me. Now I'm getting a complex.
Yeah.
Do I have spiritual BO or something? It just goes over my head and hits the person behind me, hits the person in front of me, but it misses me. And I'm going, wait a minute, is there something wrong with me? And the next morning, I'm in my meditation. The same thing happens as before. First, this was even louder. It was a whole sitar music. It was beautiful music I started hearing. And then I smell this very nice incense. And then here comes the guru in a lotus position, like floating in the air. And he looks at me and he smiles. He bows a little bit. And his eyes are twinkling, and I get this really great experience of just being with him. But then he waves and he disappears. And I thought, what is this? And then finally I go to, I think it was a karate master, and then after that another Hindu master, and both of them gave me a little bit of communication. They did the same thing. They wouldn't initiate me into whatever they're doing. And the karate master said, no, I can't take you because I can't take you where you need to go. You have a different teacher. And so finally somebody explained it to me. Oh, these very enlightened beings knew way more than I did, and they knew that what they were teaching or where they were going, taking their students, isn't where I needed to go. So they were giving me a nice send-off saying, yeah, you'll find your teacher, but I can't take you where I'm going. And so I thought, okay, that makes sense. And then I had another, this Hindu master said the same thing. He said, no, keep searching. He says, you'll find your teacher, but I can't take you where you need to go. So I thought, I don't know, wish they would tell me where I need to go, but it was like that. And so that was my early start. I was working as a nurse because when I dropped out of the medical scene, I went to study art for a while. And that I knew if I devoted my life to art, I could be a really good artist and make my living that way and everything. But I knew, no, art was not to be my profession. It's going to be my hobby for the rest of my life. The same with music. I knew if I devoted my life to music, I could be a conductor and go quite far. But because I love music and everything, but I knew from a very early age, I knew I was not to be on the path of a musician. I could play music as a hobby, but not to spend too much time and focus on it. And I didn't know why, but I knew that wasn't to be. And it's interesting because when I was in high school, I had a rock band, and we were pretty popular. And we, on a lark, we entered into this battle of the bands. And we just kept on winning and winning. You know, it goes from the local competition to the citywide and the countrywide, and then it went to the entire Far East. And we got the grand prize. We won the entire thing, and the grand prize was a recording contract with Columbia Records. I mean, that's something my friends would have given their eye teeth for at that age and at that time. And I said, oh, no, I'm going to college. That's when I was still going to medical school, planning on. And I said, no, I got to go to college, so I can't hang around. The lead singer got drafted to Vietnam and in the military, and one of the bass guitarist was going to college. So we didn't have a band after that. We just did it for fun. And so we said, we'll forfeit it to the second place winner, because we thought they were on the track to become professional musicians and rock band. And they ended up becoming very, very popular in Japan and everything. So it was, I always knew that my path didn't include those things that I thought would have been really cool, but it's not my path. And this is really important over my life, where especially young people, but even people who are looking at a second career after they go through something, they kind of lose hope a lot, and they feel invalidated that they don't know what they're supposed to do. Well, I never knew specifically what I'm supposed to do, other than I always knew I was going to be teaching. That was no question. I was trying to teach when I was 3 or 4 years old. And it's just, I met up with this brick wall of trying to teach adults when I'm 3 or 4 years old. They didn't go for it. Except for a few young men, these Japanese high school graduates that were in Japan, especially at that time. It was so difficult to get into college, to pass the exams, entrance exams. These people would study, these young adults would study after graduating from college, high school, for 1 to 2 years just to pass the exams. And then there was a boarding house for that purpose 2 doors down from where I lived. So I used to hang out. I used to go and bother these 18, 19, 20-year-olds studying day and night for this college exams. And I go and talk to them, and they'd stop. They'd make me coming by a break from their hard studying to talk about life, to talk about the universe, to talk about, things beyond the everyday occurrences in most people's lives. And they were the only ones who really listened to me. And my mom listened to me. But most other people, they just go, weird kid. Because I was talking about, I didn't know the word, but I called it colored clouds. People had colored clouds around them. And pretty much everybody I talked to, they said, there's no such thing as colored clouds. Clouds don't have colors, and they're not around people. They're in the sky. So that's what I dealt with. Whatever. So when I was seeing all these geometrical forms and mathematics, that told me, just looking at that, as a kid I couldn't explain it. I didn't have the words. I didn't have the experience. But I would tell people, if you look at that, between you and me, there's this geometrical structure. If you look at that, you'll understand what you're going through and what you're going to have to do in life. Because I knew it, but I couldn't explain it to them. But they'd look in the air with a blank stare and go, what are you talking about? And I said, just look there. He says, well, look at what, air? And I said, no, not the air. What's in the air? Because I thought it was in the air. And they look at the air, and there's nothing in the air except air. And so the funny thing, I think most kids experience this, and that's where they shut down their natural psychic abilities, their ability to see clairvoyantly, auras and energy, spirit, and all of that, and what's going on with people, their ability to experience, to hear, like clairaudiently, and to get thoughts telepathically, they try to talk to people, and everybody shuts them down, saying that you're just imagining things, or I didn't even get you're imagining things. They said, there's nothing like that. And so being a kid, I'm just like most kids, you think it's all about you, right? So if somebody doesn't understand you, then you're the one who's not doing it right. Something's wrong with you. And so the minute I go, gee, the only thing I really was looking for was communication. I didn't care what kind of communication, but I wanted to get into communication with everybody. But people refused. As far as I was concerned, they were just not communicating. They said stuff to me, but it's not communication. They were just saying stuff. And I could tell the communication wasn't a two-way thing going. And it wasn't from who I was to who they were, and from who they were to who I am. I didn't know why. It just doesn't seem to happen. And so then, every time, like when the mathematical geometrical stuff was first, when I was 3, 4, 5 years old, and it just kept on failing, and I finally said to myself, this isn't working. And the minute I said to myself, this is not working, it went away. And I didn't know until years and years later, looking back at this, my energy dropped from a very high spiritual level to a lower spiritual level. And when it dropped, instead of seeing it as geometrical forms, I saw everything as colors, energy as colors. And that's when I start to see the colored clouds, the air around people had colors. But had I known, somebody told me, that's called an aura, then I would have had at least a word that a few people might have understood. So when I talked to people, I talked about their colored clouds changing colors. And that's why I knew how they felt, or they start to feel bad, or they start to feel better, or that they were confused about something or whatever. And nobody could hear that. So eventually I said to myself again, I didn't know this was turning me off. I said to myself, I decided, well, that's not working either. Because again, my purpose was I want to get into communication with these people. And it's not working how I'm going about it. So the minute I said it's not working, the auras didn't completely disappear. It just kind of started to go into the background, so it wasn't in my face anymore. It wasn't this brilliant, vivid light that was everywhere. It was kind of in the background. I can see the physical stuff and the physical face and the body more, and the auras a little bit less. But I went on and I didn't talk about the auras and everything anymore. I just noticed it. And I did notice it come up to the foreground when people got extremely intense emotionally, and they were very, very passionate or very frightened or very guilty or in pain. It got stronger. But the rest of the time, on the average, it was a little bit more in the background. So this is how I went. And it wasn't until halfway through 5th grade that I'm asking, what are people expecting me to do, or something I'm not meeting up with other people's expectations. And that's why I'm just not connecting. And finally, I was looking at all the students. I was in a gifted class in that year. I was either in the gifted class or the retarded class. The school people who made those decisions knew I wasn't normal. They couldn't tell whether I was way below normal or way above normal. So pretty much every year until 5th grade, I get put into the low end of the bottom of the totem pole or at the top, never in the middle. And I was like a ping pong ball going back and forth. And 5th grade, I started in what the kids called the retardo class, because it was not just your ordinary remedial class. It was kind of a lost cause class. It was, it's, according to all the other kids, if you were so dumb you couldn't even make it in the remedial class, you got sent to Mr. McGowan's class. And I was in Mr. McGowan's class. And that was interesting because the class, from the first day I walked in, I didn't like it. It was battleship gray. The entire classroom was battleship gray. And I liked the kids in the class. I didn't see anything wrong with the kids in the class. They weren't dumb. They were bright, could be very happy kids. But in this class, nobody was happy. The teacher wasn't happy. And it was just memorization and repeating things over and over and over. And so, but about 1 month into the class, Mr. McGowan, he's grading papers, and he jumps up, points at me, points at a couple other boys in the class, and says, "Help Tamura walk down the class to Miss Wilkinson's class." That's all he said. So the two boys he pointed at helped me carry my desk and my chair, and we walked down like 3 doors down to Miss Wilkinson's class. And when I walked into Miss Wilkinson's class, it was like, gee, the world turned to spring. It was all bright yellow. And I thought, wow, it's so much happier and so much brighter, and I just liked being in that class. But this was the gifted class, and they were already far along into their studies, and I was way behind. So I felt like a moron because I just didn't understand what they were doing, and I was in the slowest group in the fastest class, and still I was lagging way behind. But I was looking at, what am I supposed to do here? And I realized all the brightest kids were now what I would call intellectualizing. They were, in my child perspective, they were making up reasons for everything. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So it's not about if you know the right answer, because until then, I did everything intuitively. I would look at the question or the problem or the assignment and intuitively know the answer or what I needed to do. But that never got me anywhere in school, except suspicion. If I got the right answer, say, on a test, and the teacher would ask, "Well, Michael, how did you get this answer?" I said, "I don't know. I just got the answer." And then they would suspect me of cheating. Whose paper did you look at? Who gave you this answer? I said, nobody. I just knew the answer. Said, no, but you can't explain how you got the answer. I said, no, because I don't know how I got the answer. I just knew it. If I got the answer wrong, it was fine. that I couldn't explain it and that I didn't know how I got the answer because it was the wrong answer. But it was only a problem if I got it right. And every time I got the answer right and I couldn't explain how, I was suspected of cheating. And I wouldn't get a good grade. The teacher wouldn't believe me. And so then I go, God, what am I supposed to do? Oh, I'm supposed to explain things. Well, how do you explain things that you don't know how to explain? It's just you know the answer. So then I realized, oh, I have to make up an explanation that sounds good. And so I start practicing making up an explanation. And the better I got at making up the explanation, the better grades I got. And the more the teachers thought, I thought, oh, he's a very good student. And I started to be an A student. And I did that with every class. And I got straight A's after that. And so at first, that was great because, wow, I'm now popular amongst the teachers, and the other kids would talk to me, and we got into communication. But after a year or two of this excitement of, hey, I'm getting to be somebody, right? People respect me. People talk to me. They seek me out, and I get good grades. And I'm not put into the retardo class anymore. And I was having a good time like that. But then, as I went along, I started to experience this emptiness inside. And I didn't know what that was. I never had that. I was always full. I was very happy. I was full inside, bright, like having the sunshine inside. And then now it's starting to get cloudy, and I'm feeling empty, and it's not so joyful. But I should be happier because people like me, and the teachers think I'm great, and I'm getting good grades, and everything. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Yeah, that was what I'm supposed to do. But it didn't make me happy. It made me lonely. I finally, by the time I got to high school, and I'm very popular. I'm elected as president of my class, as secretary treasurer of the whole school, the youngest one ever, and I'm getting straight A's and A pluses, and I'm getting offered scholarships to college, all kinds of things. And I'm making it on all the sports teams I went out for, except basketball. Yeah, basketball. The Referees Association begged my coach to recommend me to the wrestling or football team, and because I was a hazard on the basketball court. I'm short, and I play basketball like I play, like it's hockey or football, and tall, lanky kids were getting injured, so they wanted me off the team. So anyway, but I was having a great time in all the activities of school and social levels in school. But it didn't matter if I was in the middle of the party and everybody's talking to me. There's not any communication. What I really knew as communication. It wasn't until years later I realized, what I called communication, real communication, was spirit to spirit. I'm communicating as who I am as spirit to who you are, who someone else is as spirit. We're recognizing each other that we're the same. We're the same light. We're the same brightness. We're the same beingness. And it took me many years to get to that understanding. But even as a kid and as a teenager, I knew, when I wasn't communicating with people like that and in communication with people like that, there was this emptiness. There was this great sense of separation, isolation, loneliness, even if I was, very popular, if successful in school, everything just was empty. So I said, this isn't going to fly. I said, so then I started looking back at, when did I start to feel this way? And it started around halfway through 5th grade and into 6th grade. When I take away the external excitement of getting heard and people being interested in me and stuff, I realized, no, as I was excited about things, but I still felt empty, like there's something missing. Then I went back further in my life, earlier, and no, even if I was kind of lonely because I couldn't talk to people, the loneliness was more in relationship to other people, not inside myself. Inside myself, I was always happy. I talked to caterpillars. I talked to beetles. I talked to grasshoppers. I talked to rabbits. But I just couldn't talk to people. I talked to people, but there wasn't a communication. So then I realized, okay, somehow, whatever I did during that later grade school into junior high, that's when something went off somewhere. And so once I realized that around 14 years old, maybe 15, and I said, I got to get out of here. And so I was going on 16, and I was a junior in high school. Well, I knew there's one more whole year of high school. And I look at, no, I got to get out of here. In fact, I knew I should have gotten out of here when I was 12. But okay, I got to make up for lost time, and I got to get out of here. How do I do that? And that's a long story, but this is when I start to just totally follow my intuition. What do I do? Go over there. What do I do? Talk to this person. What do I say? Just talk to this person, and you'll start to know what to say. And I start to live like that, and it just opened up. Every place where someone even deliberately put an obstacle in my way, and that obstacle in high school was my principal, the final arbitrator in the entire school was my nemesis. Every other teacher said, I'll write your recommendation. If you want to graduate from high school this year, at the end of the junior year, I'll write your recommendations for college. I'll do whatever you want, because you don't have any more classes to take. The only class you're required is senior English, and even the English teacher said, if you come in for summer school, I'll give it to you so you can get out of here and start college next semester. And so I got everybody's approval, but I asked this principal, and the principal says, no way. No way are you going to. You have to come to senior, and you have to go through the whole year. And even if you don't have anything except for wood shop to take or in senior English, you have to do that, and I won't graduate you otherwise. So I'm going dead end. But I'm going, what am I going to do? And then that evening, my dad comes home from work, and he says, are you doing any of your sports stuff or band practice or anything on Saturday? And I said, no. Just so happened, nothing was scheduled for Saturday. And he says, I'm in a big tournament, and I need a caddy. I forgot to reserve a caddy. They don't have anyone. I said, oh, sure, I'll caddy, even though I don't know how to caddy. I don't have a clue about golf. But I figured he just needed me to carry his golf clubs around for 18 holes. So I said, sure, I'll do that. So I go to a golf tournament, and I'm still thinking about how I'm going to get around my principal at school so I can go to college, because I already had an acceptance letter from the chancellor of the University of California, who was on a speaking tour of Japan, the American schools in Japan, and I cornered him and said, here's my situation. I need to get out of here. And he looked at my transcripts, said, fill out this application in 20 minutes, because I'm leaving in 20 minutes, and give it to me, and I'll personally process your application. 2 weeks later, I get an acceptance letter personally from him, and he said, the only condition is you got to get your principal's signature on this statement for the college saying he officially graduates me a year early. And I go, oh no, back to that again. And he won't do it. I took him the paper, and he won't sign it. And so I go to this golf tournament, and I'm ready to caddy for my dad, and I get introduced to the foursome, the three other people that was in the foursome with my dad in this tournament. Well, the fourth person I get introduced to turns out to be my principal's boss's 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 boss.
Wow.
He's the single most powerful authority in the entire U.S. military, government, Department of Defense school systems in the entire Far East, including Japan, but not limited to Japan. And all the American Department of Defense schools in the Far East on all the military bases he was in charge of. And I said, Dad, my life depends on this. Sorry, you're going to caddy for yourself. I have to caddy for this guy. So I go over to this guy, introduce myself, and I said, can I caddy for you? And I noticed you don't have a caddy. And he said, sure, that would be great. And I tell him right off the bat, before the tournament, what my problem is in school. And I got the acceptance from college, but my principal won't let me. And he starts talking to me, in between hitting the ball. And he's asking me tons of questions. And most of the 18 holes, he gives me a lecture about, well, you're very young. And when you're 16-year-old and you're dealing with, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, that's a huge difference in the social levels, emotional and psychological and everything. Not like if you're, 35 and 40 years old, it's not that big of a difference. But at that age, it's a huge difference. And here's all the downside of doing that. And so then I go through 18 holes, and he turns out to be a very good golfer. And he's got this long putt on the 18th hole, and I take him the putter, and he goes, Michael, I'm going to sink this, 12-foot putt. And I said, great. He says, before I sink it, I've told you pretty much everything I can think about to try to discourage you from doing what you want to do. How do you feel now? And I said, not discouraged at all. I'm going to go through with this one way or the other. And he goes, I thought so. Okay, well, I can't be a hypocrite because I did exactly the same thing when I was 16 that you're about to do. And the reason I talked to you for 18 holes about, the downside of it is because I have some regrets. And I said, well, even so, you're the top superintendent, the chief of this, hundreds of thousands of students and faculty and everything. I said, that's not a bad situation, is it? He said, no, you're right. And I'll talk to your principal first thing Monday morning. I show up to school Monday morning. There's a note on my homeroom desk. Please come to the principal's office. I go there, and the secretary of the principal gives me the signed release form that I'm officially graduated after this semester, and I have the blessings of the principal and the school to go to college in the fall. And I said, oh, I'd like to thank the principal. And she goes, oh, he's gone for the day. Mm-hmm. He did not even want to see me. Mm-hmm. But it was great. I said, okay, now I'm out of here. So that's just one of the experiences that I went through, and it got me in college at 16, and that was before I decided, no, medicine is not my path. And but each step, it wasn't a wrong decision. By applying to college to thinking that I'm going to go into medicine, got me to California. And once I got out of the college, I didn't experience that as a failure or wrong mistake or anything like that. I just realized that was just my next step. And then I started to look, and then I got to that place where my friend got ill, and then I got the question, and I started to seek for a teacher and said, okay, there's somebody out there. And I intuitively knew I wasn't living in San Francisco at that time. I was living in Berkeley, and I intuitively knew. No, I was living in San Francisco at that time. I intuitively knew I have to walk around the streets of San Francisco to find my teacher. And once I had this question, I still got doors closed in my face a lot. Everybody, they were nicer, but they said, sorry, I don't know, I was asking everybody. I put my hand on this friend of mine who was very much in pain, And 20 minutes she was dancing and felt better than she has in months, and I was on the floor in pain. What did I do right? What did I do wrong? Can you teach me? And everybody said, sorry, no, I can't. Don't know what you're talking about. And then once in a while, I got some healer that said, yeah, I've heard about stuff like that, but I don't know how to teach you. And so I just kept on walking around San Francisco, and one day I'm walking very fast around the sidewalk in San Francisco, and I literally ran into this girl, this young woman, a college woman, and she had a bunch of books, flew all over the place. I'm apologizing. I'm picking up all the books for her and getting this straightened out. And I look at her and, whoa, she's really cute. See, this I've learned from years of experience. My spirit guides, they go, how do we get to him? How do we get through to him? Right? And so, okay, let's put a cute girl in front of him, and he'll follow her. So I pick up the books for her and everything, and she looks at me and says, she goes, I'm going to a writer's workshop at this writer's house. Do you want to come along? And I said, whoa, I'm not going to turn down that invitation. But at that time, I had no interest in writing or novelist or anything. So I walk in, there's 30 people in the class, college students, and she goes right in, sits in the middle of the class. I sit there's a one chair at the front door, and I sit at the front door thinking, just in case I get bored, I don't want to stick around, I don't want to disturb the class, so I'll just sneak out. And I'm sitting there, and sure enough, after about 15 minutes, I'm going, all I hear the teacher saying is blah, 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 blah. And because I wasn't interested in this subject. It was 19th century novelists, American novelists. And now I'd be interested. But back then, no, writing was the last thing. Reading was the last thing. I wasn't interested. And so I thought, as cute as that girl is, I think, she's into the class. I think I'm just going to go. I couldn't get up off of the chair. It was as if somebody had me crazy glued to the chair. I couldn't get up. And it's like being bolted onto the chair or more to the floor. I'm going, this is weird. Never happened to me before. And I'm using my hands and arms to push myself off of the chair. I couldn't push myself off of the chair. And I'm going, whoa, what is going on? And so the workshop's going on, and I just can't leave. And all of a sudden, this other one, not the girl that I followed in, but this other woman in the middle of the class stands up while the teacher's teaching, and she's waving her arms around with her finger pointing at nobody in general, nobody particular, and she's whirling around in the middle of the class. Everybody stops like she's crazy, and she starts saying, a weird thing happened to me. And everybody stops and listens. She said, really weird. And then she goes, last night, my roommate went and got this weird thing called an aura reading at this psychic institute in Berkeley. And right there, I go, I got to go see this place. And she says the name, Berkeley Psychic Institute. And I said, okay, never heard of the place. But all of a sudden, she sits down, and everybody's going, whoa, I hope she's not dangerous. She's kind of crazy. But all I got is, okay, that's where I have to go. And now I can stand up. And I go, that's weird. I stand up, sneak out of the door, and I go running to this was before cell phones, of course, and running to a phone booth, look up Berkeley Psychic Institute in the white pages, and it's listed. And it says 2229 Ward Street in Berkeley. I run over to a bus stop for a bus to Berkeley, and I hop on, get to Berkeley, get off, find 2229 Ward Street. It's this little house in the suburbs, so to speak, of Berkeley. And there's no signs. There's no indication it's an academy or an institute or a school. It's just a house. And it's got a 3x5 card on it, typewritten, please knock. And when you come in, take your shoes off. And I go, oh, I heard about these spiritual, metaphysical, mystical places. Everything's in code. and everything's a test, so I better do it right. I got to pass this test. And so I knock on the door gently, and then it opens up wide, and this little old lady, like 75, 80-year-old lady, gray hair, white hair, short, standing there looking at me. And I was about to be very nice and smile and say hello, and she barks at me. She goes, "What do you want?" And I take a step back, and I'm going, "Whoa, okay." And I'm going, "Oh, this is a test. She's the guard dog, and this is a test. Okay, don't let it bother you." I said, "Is this the Berkeley Psychic Institute?" And she goes, "So what if it is?" And I go, "Okay, if it is, may I please come in?" "No." I go, 3 strikes, I'm out. I failed. And then she waits a second, and I don't know where to go from there. And she goes, "Nobody's here. Come back at 7:30 tonight." And then, wham, she literally slams the door in my face. And I go, okay, hey, at least I didn't strike out. She told me come back at 7:30. So I call a friend and says, "You want to come to this psychic place? I don't know what it is. I don't know what they do, but that's where I'm going to go at 7:30. So she comes over. We go together, and we go into this place, follow everybody else in, take our shoes off, which I grew up that way in Japan. And then everybody's going into all these different, like 4. The fourth room was real, half a room. Well, all the other rooms filled up, so we go into the last room with a few people. And 2 people sit down, and then another person sits in front of them, and they start to do something. The 2 people sitting down close their eyes, and they're kind of waving their hands around, and the person sitting in front of them has their eyes open, and they're nodding at what this other 2 people are saying. I thought, and I never seen a reading or anything like that. So I'm going, God, this is interesting. These people are telling the other person about herself. And so I'm listening to the whole thing, but I'm also, this is a test. I'm sure this is a test. So I better look spiritual and metaphysical. How do you look spiritual and metaphysical? And I thought, I know how to be in a full lotus position. I was, slender and very flexible at that time, so I could put myself into a full lotus position pretzel. So I sit in a full lotus position, and in the corner of the room, be very, respectful. And I thought, that should look very spiritual, right? And so then I'm listening to this thing going on, which later on I found out was an aura reading. And then, all of a sudden, the whole room turns golden. And I'm going, whoa, what just happened? And people start to laugh. They start to twitter. They're like, ah, ah, and the whole feeling in this room lightens up, and it becomes more fun and happy, and it's all golden. And I'm just looking at this gold, and I'm going, wow. And then the door slams open, and this kind of jolly old guy walks in with a pot belly, and he just goes straight to one of the people sitting together facing this third person, and he practically slams his hands down on this woman's shoulder, and he goes something, so-and-so, you're not grounded enough. Get yourself grounded. And he laughs, and he turns around, and I thought, whoa, that's interesting. What's that about? And then he looks at me. He looks down at me sitting on the floor. First thing he says is, oh, no, another Chinaman in a Japanese body. Yeah. I'm sitting there going, I didn't feel insulted or I didn't feel like it was a racist remark or anything. I felt like it rang a bell. And of course, genetically, ancestrally, I'm 100% Japanese. But a Chinaman in a Japanese body. And most people, if they were just listening to his words, would have just, especially now, would have said, wow, what a racist, because he's all white, blue-haired, blue-eyed, blonde-haired kind of a guy. But I'm sitting there going, no, that struck a chord. I don't know what chord that was, but something happened. And that's all he said. He laughs, turns around, and walks out the door. And I thought, and then the other activity resumes. And I go, that was interesting. And about 20 minutes later, again, the energy kind of simmers off in that room. And then, again, it turns all gold. And then people start laughing a little bit more. And then the door opens. The same guy walks in. And he looks at me and says, oh, no, you're still here? and I'm going, yeah. And he says, why is he still sitting in that stupid position on the floor? And I go, oh, I thought this would make me look spiritual. And he saw right through that. He said, get off the floor. And he said, I don't want you to blow your first chakra away, sitting in energy like this in a lotus position on the floor. And I didn't know what that meant, but he had somebody get me a chair. I sat in the chair. He says, that's better. And just sit there. And I said, okay. and then he points to my girlfriend and says, come over here. And sits her down on the chair directly across from me about, maybe 10 feet away. And he's standing behind her. And he puts his hands on her shoulders. And it's like he's looking into her head from above. And he's looking, And then he starts saying things like, when you were 4 years old, when your dad got you this red tricycle with these colorful streamers on the handlebars, remember that? And she goes, uh-huh. And he goes, yeah. And then you took it out for a spin and you fell over on the sidewalk in front of your house, cracked your head on the sidewalk. And everybody freaked out, and you got into trouble, and you're bleeding from your forehead and stuff. And she goes, oh, yeah, I remember that. And he says, yeah, the pain picture from that is still in you. And so I'm going to take that out. Is that okay? She goes, okay. And then he does something, and she starts smiling, and she gets brighter. And I feel a little better. And I go, that's weird. What's going on? I mean, one thing, whatever he's doing to her, that she's changing, but I'm changing. I feel better when he did whatever he did to her. And then he goes on with this and talks to her about something about a boyfriend when she was, a teen, like her early teens or something. And she got hurt emotionally. And she goes, yeah. And he does all this stuff. And then finally, like, he's doing this for about 10 minutes. And then he says, now, I'm going to put my fingers on your head. Is that okay? And she says, yeah. And close your eyes. And he said, just imagine you're right in the center of your head. Okay? And she goes, okay. And then he says, I'm going to fill your head up with energy. And you're going to feel this kind of heat coming up your back. And don't let that frighten you. He says, just let it go, okay? She goes, okay. He says, don't try to fight it or stop it or anything like that. She goes, okay. And he goes, and when your head feels completely full, you tell me, it's full, okay? And she goes, okay. And he does something. He closes his eyes, and he's doing something with his fingers on her head. And then next thing, she goes, okay, it's full. And he goes, whew, just pulls his hands off of her head. And when he did that, the entire room became bright, just this clear, bright white. I couldn't see anything else, I couldn't see her, him, the walls, anything. The whole room just filled up with this light. So bright, I couldn't see anything else. And it just lasted a second. And then it kind of simmers off, and I could see the physical things again and people. But I felt so clear and so free. And I could physically see so clearly with my eyesight every little smudge, every little insect, everything, detail on the far wall, like 15, 20 feet away. And I couldn't see that before. It was all kind of hazy. Everything is sparkling. And I felt better than I have in I don't know how long. And so I'm going, whoa, what just happened? He did something to her, and she's 10 feet away from me, and I went through this total incredible experience. And obviously she did too, because she's just giggling, laughing, and her eyes were blazing light. I go, I'm not leaving this place until I learn what he just did. And that was the beginning of my training with this teacher, this clairvoyant spiritual teacher named Louis Bostwick, who on the outside looked like a, regular guy, like he might have been a truck driver or a mechanic or something. And he talked like a regular guy. He acted like a regular guy, except when he did stuff like that. And when he did stuff like that, magic happened. And I'm going, yeah, that gold light that filled the room was always just a second before he walked into the room. Didn't happen any other time. And I thought, whoa, okay, I gotta figure out, I gotta find out what he does, how can I do this stuff, right? And I knew this was the master of this place. He knew what he's doing. And I gotta find out. I gotta learn from him. But I didn't know how you go about doing that. So after this other session finished, the person who was sitting in front of this two readers, now I know as readers, left already. And then this man, Louis, says to me, you want one of those things? And he points to the two readers. And I said, yeah. And he said to the readers, you guys too tired? This was like 11:30 at night. And he goes, you guys too tired, or you want to do another one? And they go, hey, we'll do another one. He goes, all right, go over, sit over in front of them. I flew over there. sit in front of, and Louis leaves, and I'm with these two people. And then shortly after they start, the first thing that happens is when they start, I didn't know what they were doing, the readers, but when they start, naturally I just close my eyes, and in my head I go, I just have to match them. And so I decided to match them, and then I could feel my energy changing. I'm going higher and to this different place. And then one of the man who's the main reader says, excuse me. And I go, okay, I open my eyes. And he says, you're matching us. And I'm going, hot damn, yes, yay, it's working. And he says, please don't do that, because if you match us, it makes it very difficult for us to read you. I said, oh, darn. And he says, could you not match us and back off? Nice way to say, get out of our space. And so I said, okay, and I kind of pulled my energy back and decided not to match them. And he goes, oh, much better. Now we can read you. And they gave me a really good reading. I could identify with everything and relate with everything they said. It was short, like half an hour. But about 10 minutes into it, this man Louis comes back in. The room fills up with gold. Everybody's in a better mood. And he's dragging this young woman. You can tell she doesn't want to be there. But he's literally pushing her into this room. And he goes, Jane, sit down. He pulls up a chair next to these two people. And he says, Jane, sit down. And she sits down. And I go, whoa, this guy doesn't mess around. And he puts his hands on her shoulders and says, get grounded. And she's like shaking in her boots, and she's got her eyes closed, but I can tell she's afraid. She's shaking in her boots. And he turns to the guy, the main reader in the middle, and he says, watch her. Make her do the rose reading. And it's all code language to me. I don't know what they're talking about. And this man Lewis leaves. And then this guy in the middle, a really nice man, he says, okay, Jane. He's very much more gentle. He says, okay, Jane, you do the rose reading. And this woman, Jane, is shaking her head. No. And she said, I can't. And he says, well, just start talking. Just start, saying whatever you see. You know how to put up that image of the rose, and just start saying what you see. He says, I can't. He's refusing. And obviously this nice guy is not getting anywhere. The door opens again, and this man Lewis walks back in. He slams his hands on her shoulders, and not really that hard, but enough to go boom. And he goes, stop messing around, Jane. Just do it. And I'm going, this is fascinating. And all of a sudden, this woman, Jane, starts to talk. And she's giving me this reading that was almost better than the other two people. She was just nailing all kinds of things about where I am, how I am, and past life stuff, and everything made sense. And I'm going, and this man Lewis walks away, leaves the room. And I go, wow, what just happened? Is this a training? I want some of this stuff. And so after they finished, they go, do you have any questions? I said, yeah. Is this a training? Is this a school? And everybody said, yes. And I asked the Jane person, obviously she was a novice and beginner. And I said, are you just a beginner? And she said, oh, I just started today. This was the first time I ever did this. Yeah. And I said, you did fantastic. All of you did great, but you did fantastic. And she smiled. She goes, oh, thank you. I said, so you're learning this? And she goes, I guess. And I said, okay, how do I get into this place? And the guy says, oh, you're in luck. Or the secretary, Catherine, is in her office down the hall. You go to the last room, this little cubby hole in the hall, end of the hall, and you'll see Catherine. She'll tell you all about it. And I said, I ran out of that room. I don't even remember. I think I just ditched my girlfriend in that room. I just ran out. I couldn't think of anything else, but I got to get into this place. And the first time I ever been in an energy that I understood, in a thing that just, I didn't understand, the language. I didn't understand exactly what they said, but I knew what was going on. I just felt it, and I knew it. And so I go running down the hall, and I see this cat. Are you Catherine? Yes. How do I get into this thing? And she goes, you're in luck. It's not what you saw tonight, but you have to take this beginner's meditation class first for 8 weeks and a healing class for 8 weeks. I said, I don't care what you put me in. Just put me in something. And she said, you're in luck. Tomorrow is Saturday. The classes, the new set of 8-week classes starts tomorrow morning at this church right 1 block down the street. And so show up at this church 1 block down the street, and you'll be your meditation teacher in the morning and the healing teacher in the afternoon. Oh, no, your healing teacher in the morning and your meditation teacher in the afternoon. And it costs you $80 for each class for the 8 weeks. Great. I could afford that. And so I did that, and that's where I started my training. And within about, a few weeks, they said I could join the clairvoyant training that this man Lewis taught. And, I couldn't wait. But the beginning part of it was hilarious. I'm sure it was hilarious to him. It wasn't hilarious to me. He just sat me He said, no, here's a box of crayons, here's a clipboard with a chart. You just color the aura colors what the readers say they are. I said, when do I get to read? He said, you're not ready. I go, wait a minute, I already see the aura. He said, you're not ready. Sit in the back, ground yourself, run your energy, find your space, and then you'll get assigned to read somebody when you're ready. 3 months. Oh no, 1 whole month, 4 weeks. I'm sitting in the back. I'm there every day, and every reading you could be in. And he says, go in the back, sit, and color the crayons. I said, okay. I'm a pretty good artist, I could color. So I'm coloring, but I found from the very first time, if I sat in the back, I didn't have to close my eyes. I could see every color, everything that the readers were saying. And I thought, oh, this is great. I could read from back here. And so I did that, and I started playing with it. I'd start to color in the layer, the color of the aura before they said it. And then, yep, it's the same color. Great. And I start to, for myself, what this color means and that color means. And the readers start to say what this color means and that color means. And it was exactly what I was already thinking. I thought, great, I could sit back here all, the rest of the program and do this stuff. And then the next time I'm assigned to a reading, Louis says, okay, now you sit in the line. You get to read. And I said, damn. All he was waiting for was me to back off and settle down and ground myself and not be, all over everywhere saying, let me read, let me read, let me read. And the minute I let it go, he said, now you can do it.
Yeah, you're ready, yeah.
Yeah, so that was a great experience. And from then on, I studied with him for 20 years. But after the first year, he said, okay, I need an assistant. And he made me his assistant. And then what he used to do, I can't tolerate alcohol. I don't drink a drop, right? I can't drink beer. I can't drink wine. I can't drink anything. Because if I drink a little bit, I'm on the floor. I'm beet red. I feel awful. It's always been like that. But Louis was a good drinker. He likes his martinis with dinner and a nice bottle of wine. So he says, we got to go to dinner, and I'm going to take you out to dinner. So he takes me out to dinner in a nice restaurant, and he goes, oh, yeah, you don't drink, do you? And I said, no. And he tells the waiter, bring him a glass of red wine. He's a whip. He can't drink, so just give him a glass of red wine and give me a martini. And he says, you have to finish the glass of red wine by the time we get out of here. He says, I'm being easy on you. And I'm going, God, this is a spiritual teacher, and he's making me drink alcohol when it makes me sick. So he says, just start sipping on it. I didn't know he was doing this so he can teach me. Not about drinking, but so he can loosen me up, and he could, I would let down my guard and relax. So he had me sipping, and after I, like 1 or 2 sips of red wine, I'm just like, okay. And then I find myself completely out of the body. I'm talking to him spirit to spirit out of the body. When I listen in on what he's saying physically, verbally, he's talking about the Oakland A's baseball team and how much better they are than the San Francisco Giants. I mean, how much more spiritual can you get, right? and so I was interested in baseball, but that's what the conversation is happening at the dinner table. But up here, 3 feet above our heads, I can see him as spirit. I can see him as a soul, big, incredible being. And I'm floating up there with him, and he's teaching me something completely, has nothing to do with baseball, has nothing to do with anything, but teaching me how to become more aware, how to become, to be able to really tune into and see clairvoyantly, and how to understand, how to start to see myself more. And I didn't have trouble seeing other people, but I had trouble seeing myself, and how to get in touch with my inner being, and how to communicate with my inner self. That's what he's teaching me over dinner. And how this whole thing works. I didn't have words for it, but I knew it. I understood it. And so we had this nice dinner on the physical level, talking about baseball and other worldly things. But in spirit, this whole thing is happening. And then he goes, okay, we got to get back to the school. And he pays the bill. And he said, you didn't finish your wine. I said, I drank like 2 sips. And he said, okay, well, I'll be easy on you tonight. This is your first time. So I go, okay. So we go back to the center, and this, now it's gotten to a bigger place. In that year's time I was going through, we moved to a bigger place. And we walk in, and the front main lecture hall, the lecture room in the front, the biggest room, is sliding 2 doors. It's closed. And we pass by there. He goes, oh, I got to check on all the readings going on and everything. He goes, oh, I almost forgot. And he pushes me backwards. He says, we got to go back to this room. And he opens the door, and there's people sitting in a circle waiting. He says, oh, this is your class. You're going to teach the clairvoyant program for the next year. And I go, okay. And then he makes me go into the class and closes the door behind me. And so what can I do, right? I introduced myself to the class, and I said, I'm your clairvoyant teacher. I'm going to teach you for the next year. And everybody says, oh, hi, nice to meet you. And I start them from grounding. By the halfway point, it's a 3-hour class. In the halfway point, you're supposed to take a 15-minute break. So I'm getting close. I get to the 15-minute break. I said, okay, you guys could have a break. And I take my break, and I'm going, holy moly, what am I gonna teach for the next half of the class? I just taught the whole program. And I didn't know why the students were just like falling off their chairs. I was so enthusiastic. I said, okay, I know this, and I can teach that, and I know this, and this is how you do that. And I thought, okay, well, I should probably repeat the first half in the second half. And so I repeated it, and I start to notice when I start to repeat the very beginning things, the students kind of came alive and said, oh yeah, that's what we're supposed to do. And I thought, you know what? I'm supposed to teach this whole thing over the course of the next year, once a week. Okay, I just taught the whole thing in one half of a class. That's not right. Okay, it's not going to be good. Okay, I better slow down, and I better really start to look at how am I going to teach this stuff. So that's how I learned how to teach. One class at a time, and I started to refine how to teach it. Some things worked, some things didn't work. And so after that, it's pretty much, that's what I continue to this day. I continue to do that. I develop my teaching as I go along, and I really watch each of the students and seeing what they're getting, what they're not getting, and how do I help them get to the next step. But I know we ran out of time, right?
No, what we learned at our center, and I'm sure David learned out in Berkeley, is to allow the stream of consciousness. And when that stream of consciousness happens, a lot of questions we may have had will be answered.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, with me, the stream of consciousness never ends. So I just realized, because Raphael, my wife, came in and says, hey, you're way over time. And she's saying, we got the next thing we have to go to. And so if she didn't keep track of my time, I could do this for hours and hours and hours.
I know.
Yeah.
You too. And the truth is, Michael, let me just say this is, I've known you over the years and stuff, and you could probably, sit and talk 24/7 for the next month and barely be scratching the surface of all your experiences. That I know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true. It's just so much. And until I start to dip in and think about what kind of stories would illustrate the point I'm trying to make or would be most helpful for the students or whatever, a lot of times I forget all those stories because there's so many experiences.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot of them, and I was gonna, like I said, we're I did a little bit over the time here, and that was one of my things was before the interview was over and everything, and we won't do it tonight. I have a good feeling that we're gonna have you on again, but that's what I was gonna do is ask you. So I'm gonna have to have Michael tell us a good story, so we'll get one out of you the next time we interview. I know you have to run and but let me ask you this just real quick. I imagine Lewis in his wisdom, he probably knew when he first met you, or at some point briefly after he first met you, that he knew that you were going to be a part of things moving forward. I just always had a feeling he knew people that he met that there were going to be kind of key figures around him, and I had to think it's probably the same with you.
Yeah, he knew that way before I ever got there.
He was just waiting for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was March Madness or not, but as you were talking, I had like 5 screens up, and I usually just have like one reading screen. But it was just really interesting to follow all those different stories. It was like I didn't even have to turn the channel. I would just look at the different screen.
Yes. That's where I'm sure you've been in a TV studio, like a major TV studio. They have all those screens and all those cameras, and then the what do you call it? The producer, the director is in there going, okay, let's go to camera number 1, screen number 5. Things like that. And that's, where did they get that idea? How did they, configure that type of studio is exactly what you're talking about. That's how you see things.
Yeah.
That's how the mind works.
I want to be respectful of your time, but on one of those screens, I just saw you in high school where you had mentioned, I got to get out of here. And then in 5th grade, you had walked into the class where it was gray, and you are seen as one of a, world-renowned expert in near-death experiences. I guess maybe just being respectful of your time, we'll have you back on that. But it seemed like there was a theme which raised another bunch of questions about NDEs and out-of-body experiences. So I don't know what your time looks like now, but... Well,
if you'd like to have me on again, we could go for a full thing just on that.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But I will leave you with this. Lewis had played a key part. He's passed on in 1995, I think it was. So, but he still, comes in and does all kinds of stuff in spirit. But when I was just before I turned 21, when I first met him, that story I told of the first encounter, I was 20 years old. And by the time I was in my training and everything, halfway through the training, I turned 21. But about a month or two before I turned 21, Lewis, how he talked to me often is all of a sudden, he's sitting there and all of a sudden he'll turn around. He always called me Tamura. He never called me Michael. He goes, hey, Tamura. And he said, hey, Tamura, do you know that you have the choice on how you wish to die? So it was always like that with Lewis. We could be talking about baseball or where we're going to go to dinner, and then all of a sudden he throws things like that in the middle of it, and it's like, whoa, okay, I have a choice on how I wish to die. Well, that's one thing I never thought of, but I always knew I knew I had total choice in how I wished to live, and that's how I was living the best I can. But okay, this is a new question. How do I wish to die? I never looked at that. And then he followed it up with, we can choose to die in pain and suffering like most people do, or we can choose to die in love and at peace with ourselves. And the moment he finished saying that, I made my decision. I said, that's a no-brainer. Yeah. I wish to die in love and at peace with myself. Regardless, I didn't care about anything else in life. I said, when it's my time to go, I'm going to go in love and at peace with myself. Well, that's when I'm 20 years old. It's not until probably I was well into my 40s, 25, 30 years, maybe 50s even, that I start to really connect the dots, that everything after that decision was made on that decision I made just in that split second. And he didn't pursue that communication. He didn't go on to elaborate. That was it, and then we went on to something more mundane. And so when I look back at all my 5 near-death experiences I've had in the last 12 years, and the incredible learning I've had from that, and as I start to look back at it and start to put it together, I followed it back to that moment when I made that decision based on Lewis's question, how do you wish to die? And from that point, it set my course. And everything that's happened since then led me to all these near-death experiences, the actual experience of what people would consider physically dying, and then being conscious throughout the whole thing and returning each time and being more alive when I return than less. So yes, we can definitely set up another time to I'll share with you and your listeners the experiences I've had, both in that process of, hey, what is it like to, when you're getting ready to die or you're going to go, and physically, and then on the other side, being fully aware of having a total experience, and then fully aware of coming back to this side and going, okay, this is, but over the time period, I realized it wasn't until I spent about 7 to 10 years after I've had these near-death experiences integrating. And it wasn't until sometimes 3, 4 years later after a near-death experience that I start to be able to connect the dots in retrospect and go, whoa, I'm totally not in the same place I was before that death experience.
Wow.
But it took me, several years to integrate it. And in some ways, being able to talk about more of the deeper aspects of what I learned through those experiences. The experiences are the superficial part, It's very exciting and dramatic, but it's what you learn it takes a while before you get that deep into the experience to extract and distill the wisdom from that experience.
Wow.
Look at oh man, see. I know you gotta go, but I'm just wondering with when you say you look back, hindsight 2020, would it have been easier to have an out of body experience versus a near death experience that gets the same result?
Oh, I had all kinds of out-of-body experiences before I ever had a near-death experience.
Right.
And yes, the after effects, definitely it's easier to do it with an OBE. But every time you're out of the body, it's a different experience.
Yeah.
So the OBEs, the many, many OBEs, and I get out of my body every night to teach out of my body. It's very different than some of the experiences, spaces, and what I learned from my body actually dropping dead.
Mm.
Yeah. See, as long as the body's still alive, and you're, whether it's in deep meditation or sleeping, you're very, very much out of the body, but you're still connected.
Yeah.
When my body actually, stopped functioning, and there was a period of disconnect where I do not have, as spirit, I do not have a body anymore.
So you're witnessing the cord breaking.
Yeah. Well, in some cases, there's not even a cord there. But that's we don't want to confuse everybody. But
Sure. Well, that's actually a good place to stop. Yes, we'll definitely have you back on to talk about that in greater detail. You have just been in tune to another great podcast of Intrinsic Motivation from a homie's perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
And Michael, it was a pleasure. Let's get it on the calendar soon. We'd love to have you back on.
All right. Yes. I'd love to be back on your show. I really enjoyed my time with you, too.
Yes, thank you very much. And we'll get you scheduled for the future here, Michael.
All right.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Take care.
Listen to Intrinsic Motivation from a homie's perspective on Radio Public. It's a free, easy-to-use app that helps listeners like you find and support shows like ours. When you listen to our show on Radio Public, we receive direct financial support every time you hear an episode. Experience our show in Radio Public today by listening to the show link in our episode notes, and thank you for listening. Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for a future podcast that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.